You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
Welcome out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, and this is episode 145 of the Rock Art Podcast. And we are blessed and honored to have Dr. Aubry patching in from Portugal. He is of the French background, and he's the scientific director of both Côa Archaeological Site and their museum. Dr. Aubry, are you with us?
Yes.
It's an honor and a blessing to connect with you over the miles and smiles that we're doing. What we usually do is kick it off this way and talk about how you got into this particular archaeological niche with this magnificent museum and archaeological site. Go ahead, Doctor.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I am French. I always say that nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect. I am French. And first, before to be an archaeologist, I'm first a geologist. And I think it's something important to explain how is my approach of Palaeolithic archaeology. I study in Bordeaux, in France, because it was a center, the University of Bordeaux was a center of Palaeolithic study by the school of François Borde. And I went to Bordeaux to study Upper Palaeolithic lithic industries. But before to study rock art, I studied the stone tools. And I know my wife in Bordeaux, and my wife is Portuguese, and she showed me many sites in Portugal. But the first site they showed me are not in the open-air rock art, there were some caves, because in the 90s, when you were speaking about Paleolithic or rock art, of Paleolithic rock art, people were thinking about essentially about the caves and cave art. And the discovery of the Côa Valley was really something completely different. It was discovered during the construction of a dam. It means in 91, with the beginning of the construction of this dam, the rock art was discovered. And it changed completely because it was so many rock arts discovered in the small region. And it changed completely the notion we have about Paleolithic rock art. We were thinking it was mostly in caves. With the discovery of the rock art, we know that they also did some engraving, also some painting, but mostly some carving, engraving on open-air outcrop. And when it was discovered, and the dissemination was in 1994, and mostly in 1995, few archaeologists were specialists of Paleolithic in Portugal. And João Zilhão was the director of the park in 95, and he asked me to participate to the excavation because when we find the rock art, no archaeological site of Upper Paleolithic was known in the region, and it was necessary to look for the settlement where people were living. And during 95 and 96, at the beginning, the challenge was to find the site where people were living. It means the one argument against the datation of this rock art was that there is no archaeological site, and it was necessary to find the context. And we find the context because we understand the geology, where sites were preserved. And it was really a big challenge. And I think this geomorphology and geological approach was necessary to understand and to find the archaeological site. And why the context is very important? Because for datation of some painting, when we use some charcoal, you can use radiocarbon dating. When you are studying some engravings, what we have mostly in the Côa Valley, you need to establish what is the archaeological context. And in the Côa Valley, we find two sites with some rock art covered by sediment and by dated deposit. And it was the way what it was possible to give an edge to these rock art.
Fantastic. How amazing. I know that the great importance of geoarchaeology and the antiquity of various landforms and the preservation of those landforms are essentially important. Am I correct, Dr. Aubry?
Yes, it's essential. I think when you are studying Palaeolithic, when you are speaking from settlement from more than 12,000 years ago, geology is essential. It means if you will find the site, and it was possible in the Côa Valley to find some settlement because we're understanding how landscape is preserved, evolution of landscape.
Yes, the landscape evolution. So where did you find the actual settlements or the occupation sites that would relate roughly contemporaneous with the rock art?
We find two main categories of site. One are the site associated directly with the rock art. And the rock art is mostly concentrated at the bottom of the valley. I think we find some occupation at the bottom of the valley, but we also find some site at the plateau. It means some logistical site for hunting place. And what was really completely new in the Côa Valley, that we find site associated with rock just near the river. It was not a big surprise because it was logical to find some settlement, but also we find some settlement in granite and at the plateau. It means some higher elevation settlement. And I think what was completely new in the Côa Valley, what we find the rock arts, the context associated with rock art, but also some hunting sites. Hunting sites completely different, in some geomorphological condition, completely different from the bottom of the valley. And what I think also completely news, it's for a region where no site was known in 1995. At this moment, we have more than 30 settlements with some different hunting sites, some occupation related with the rock art. It means we have all the different categories of function of site in a small region. And also with a high density of settlement. It was not expected. In 95, everybody was saying that the center of Iberia was not occupied during Palaeolithic, Upper Palaeolithic. And now the image is completely different. We have a high concentration of occupation. And I think in the future, probably this region will be the higher concentration of site of Upper Palaeolithic of Iberia, and not only in caves area.
So what do those sites consist of, the open-air occupation sites and the hunting sites? And then what is the subject matter that you find for the rock engravings? And I also understand that there's portable, not palettes, but portable rock art imagery that have also been discovered. Those are always fascinating to me as well. Please.
Yes, it was something completely new also, but we find in one site is a Fariseo site where we find some panels covered by sediment. It means uncovered during excavation. It means the panels was not visible at the beginning of excavation, and during removing of the deposit, it was possible to see the engraving. And it was the best way for dating. It means if you have an engraving covered by sediment, dated sediment, you know that engraving are older than the deposit you are excavating. And it was a way to say that it was a minimal edge for the rock art. But in one site, Fariseo, we find also in some level of 12,000 years ago, we find some portable art. It means not some part of the panels collapsed in the layer excavated, but some slabs of schist engraved during the occupation. And just near, if you find portable arts, sometimes have 10 centimeters from the panels. But we find some completely different depiction. It means depiction from the older, early Upper Palaeolithic are stylistically completely different from the 12,000 years ago. It means the end of Upper Palaeolithic.
So what is the imagery composed of? What's the subject matter of the imagery, and how does that change over time?
During all Upper Palaeolithic, there are mostly animals. but you have some difference between the early Paleolithic and the end. But at the beginning, we have mostly some horses, ibex, it means some goat, wild goats, and red deer. There are four main species depicted in the Côa Valley at the beginning of Upper Paleolithic. At the end of Upper Paleolithic, there are depicted mostly some red deer and ibex. It means the two species. It means we have an evolution of animals. But what is interesting about rock art is that we are not depicting all the animals we are hunting. And we are fishing also, because we find some remains of bones remained during excavation in the 12,000 years ago, and we can compare what they were hunting, fishing, and what they were depicting in the portable art. And some animals are not depicted. It means we are only depicting some specific large herbivores mostly. It means this is not the menu what you were eating. There is some information. We are choosing some specific animals.
Yeah, this is what Levi-Strauss, of course, had to say. Some animals are not only good to eat, but good to think. And
yes. Yes.
And then these are what I call, and others have called, indexical animals. Indexical animals in the sense that these are the animals that are keys to the cosmology, the cosmovision of the people. Is this correct, yes. Dr. Aubry?
Yes, I think we are not representing only animals. We are representing what animals is associated with symbolic. Each animal has a symbol, is a symbol of with other meaning that's only to say. I think there's an information about hunting, of course. It means to recognize different animals at a long distance. This is something functional for hunters. But I think there's also another social information when we are depicting some specific animals. And I think also something important is what there are many times some superimposition of some depiction of different species. And I think this association, this structure of association of some animal, the orientation of the animal, left, vertical, horizontal, left, right, I think there is some meaning. And also the movement is very important, because I think we are using some flat surface, two-dimensional surface, and we are creating with the movement, but we are depicting an animal with two heads, for example, we are creating a third dimension to the support. I think it's something where we need to give a time and space, a third time and space dimension to the depiction. And there are always some living animals, not dead animals. I think it's not only functional to explain, and not only to indicate here you can find this kind of animal. It's something more complicated. I think there are really some symbolism and there are the depiction of some specific animals in some also specific places.
Yeah. Let's call the segment there. Yes. And I'll see you in the flip-flop gang, and we'll get into this particular subject with greater depth. See you in the flip-flop gang. Howdy out there in Archaeology podcast land. Second segment, and we're talking with Dr. Aubry about the Côa Museum and the Côa archaeological sites, and most importantly, the association of open-air rock art sites in the Côa Valley. Am I correct, Doctor?
Yes, it's really unique in the Côa Valley that we can study rock art in its context, in its landscape. And
its landscape context, yeah.
Yes.
You said there were some hunting sites, and that had to do perhaps with the visibility or the enabling the hunters to access the animals and perhaps channel them, or am I premature?
We are also studying the question of lithic raw material. It means supply of lithic for stone tools.
Okay.
And this is something, I think, something very important, because we can see locally what are the mobility. It means what displacement, what was the way of
how the stone moves, where it's supplied, and what kind of stone are they accessing, Doctor?
The Côa Valley is also very specific. It means geologically you have mostly some metamorphic rocks and some magmatic rocks. It means we don't find flint, this famous flint, the flintstone, and we don't find this kind of flint. It means when you find it when you are excavating and you find some flint, it's coming from a long distance. And what we find in the Côa Valley is that we find some flint and typical flint from sources from more than 150 kilometers. It means when you find it, they are using it coming from a long distance. And when we are studying the sources used. We have some flint coming from Central Iberia, 200 kilometers from Central Iberia, east. And you will find also some flint coming from central Portugal. It means 100 and 200 kilometers from the other direction. And
are there any local sources of any kind of stone that might be used for?
Yes, we use some quartz, some crystal, rock crystal.
Yes,
it means
quartz crystal.
Local. But when you find some flint, it's coming from a long distance from other place. And when we are studying it, we have a territory of almost 400 kilometers. It means
isn't that amazing? Amazing.
It's not amazing when you are comparing with hunter-gatherers.
Right.
Actual one. For example, in Australia, people are moving 500 kilometers to go to aggregation site where you find the rock arts, for example. And it means the Côa Valley is in the center of this big territory. It means it's on the path of displacement between the eastern limit and western limit. And the rock art is exactly at the center of the two different groups of hunter-gatherers. And I think the mobility, the specific landscape, it means geologically it's a unique place where you can go from east-west or west to east. You have to go to cross the river, the Côa River. It means this is a natural place for displacement, for mobility, for hunter-gatherers groups. And the flint is showing this mobility system. And it means you have some social structure. It means you have some contact. And it's a way to explain why rock art stylistically from a long distance is very similar. It means we find some depiction almost like the same that we find in northern Spain, for example, or southern France. It means we find exactly the same kind of stylistic convention. And it's why, because the upper Palaeolithic hunter-gatherers were very high mobility. It means, and
very high mobility, yes.
Mobility, and also, but we need some, if you are doing this kind of displacement, you need some mark in the landscape. And I think rock art is also some mark in the landscape for displacement, for mobility. It means with some, of course, you have a message, symbolic message associated with some depiction, but I think, and some functional information about hunting to recognize animals. But I think you have also some function for displacement and mobility. And in the Côa Valley, I think the question of aggregation site is really a good explanation. It means you are on the path, eastern to western displacement, mobility, but also you are in a place where the landscape has been modified. And what is opener rock art for me are some of the early upper Palaeolithics we find rock art are the first monument. We say always that monuments, the oldest one are Neolithic. I think they are Palaeolithic because we are completely transforming the landscape. And by some very simple, some depiction by engraving and carving, we are sometimes with some high density of superimposition of depiction, we are modifying completely the message and the landscape. I think this what opener is something completely new. What we have a scale of intervention, anthropic intervention is at the scale of the landscape and not of the cave, of the small volume. It means we are really completely modifying the visibility and the signification of the landscape.
I think when I read quickly that some of these images are quite large. Is that correct?
Yes, we find in 2020 we find a rock sand of 3.5 meters long. It means it seems to be the real scale of the animal, of the male rock sand. And it's very important because to realize this large engraving is not the same thing that to do 50 centimeters depiction, but you are looking all the part of the engraving at the same time. It means when you are engraving 3.5 meters, when you are engraving the horns, You don't see the tile, for example. It means that you have to produce a first draft, and to organize it as a function. You need the panels to do it, to do 3.5 meters. But I think the function is completely different. And we have some.
So the function of the larger images are very different, you say?
I think are different from engraving, but you have some small engraving of 3 centimeters, for example, mostly at the end of the Upper Palaeolithic. But I think the meaning, and when people are asking what is the meaning of rock art, I think the meaning of depiction of 3.5 meters is not the same than 3 centimeters. It means there's not only one explanation, there's many explanations. And it's why visibility also technique used for, if you are using some baking, for example, some large baking, some abrasion, you have a visibility of 150 meters. It means it's not the same. Something you can see at 150 meters has not the same meaning that something you are looking at only visible at 1 meter or 2 meters. I think it's why the opener is very interesting, because you can study the context and also the visibility already of art.
Over time, is there a change in the methods of crafting rock art, rock drawings, petroglyphs, or is there a difference at all in the locations and landscape context of the rock art over time?
Yes, first, the early Upper Paleolithic rock art in the Côa Valley, they are mostly superimposition, packing, large packing, superimposition of depiction, and they are mostly just near the river. And after, during the Upper Paleolithic, we are using some tributaries of the Côa Valley. You have occupation of the slope, and at some time at the end, we are using the plateau. It means you have using every place at the end of the Upper Paleolithic. At the beginning, we have really some specific place where it's possible to cross the river, mostly, and just near the river. The biggest concentration of depiction with some famous superimposition, with animation also, are mostly just facing the river. And we are in some place where it's possible to cross the river. I think the question of mobility, visibility in some specific place. And also, they use some very specific panels. It means some morphology of the panels clearly associated with the river, with the water. Yes.
So again, they would choose some of the most visible places and the ones that perhaps had cosmological or religious significance, or even significance for where subsistence and other cultural activities were taking place. But as their numbers increased, or as their perspective changed, they moved, and then they changed the locations they were crafting their images. Is that correct?
Yes, and something interesting also, the question of superimposition.
Okay.
At the beginning, we were thinking that superimposition was an accumulation during a long time. We're thinking that 30,000 years ago, we did an engraving, and after 25,000 years ago, another one superimposed under the other one. I think and with the excavation of Fariseu rock art with panels covered by sediment, it's possible to say that when the superimposition is a composition, it's not an accumulation. It means it's voluntary. We are superimposing some depiction when we are doing engraving.
So the superimposition was meant and intended. It wasn't just part and partial by accident. It was something that had meaning.
Result of a long time accumulation. It was really some voluntary when we did, and it's part of composition. One depiction under another one has a meaning. And the species also has meaning, one is under the other one, but I think it's not the result of an accumulation of people, of different people. It means it's the same, and also we can study the technique they use. And when you are using the technique used and the tools, the stone tools they use to do the packing, for example, we know that superimposition was done in a short time, and it's really a composition short time by the same, maybe the same person or from the same school, artistic school. And it was really a surprise, because at the beginning we were thinking that people are putting some different depiction during a long time. No, it's really superimposition is really intentional. There's a meaning of this superimposition because
it communicates something.
It communicates something because there are some available panels just near the big superimposition and they don't use. Sometimes they don't put one depiction in the other one. It means they really choose a specific panels and depiction, superimposition as a meaning. And superimposition is something they use mostly at the beginning of Upper Palaeolithic. At the end, during the Magdalenian, it means 17,000 years ago, where we have some juxtaposition. It means you can have several animals on the same panels, but they are not superimposed. They are like an interaction between the different ones. And it's
wonderful.
Not like a narrative story. It means we are telling a story. Good. At the beginning is something more structured. It's something like it
evolves and changes, and it's the structure of the particular composition that matters. Okay, let's close it there. And we'll pick up for round 3. See you in the flip-flop, gang. Okay, gang, this is Dr. Alan Garfinkel with Dr. Aubry talking about Côa rock art. And Dr. Aubry, you've spent quite a lifetime working on this Côa Valley material. And what's the takeaway? What do you get in terms of the feeling, the emotion, the religious content? What do you make of all this? Just off the top of your head, your imagination, and maybe your gut feeling that you get from working on this project for so long.
The Côa Valley is really a very special project because to stop a dam, the construction of a dam is not very easy.
No.
And it's and when you do it, if you do it, you have really to give a response to the society. It means you cannot stop a dam and say we can do some excavation, some research, and people will see the result in 20 years ago.
No, you had a responsibility.
It's a responsibility, and it's a social responsibility. It means you stop a project, a dam project, you have to give to people some information.
And how did you go about that?
It was, for example, the Pharisee site where we find the big depiction of a rock scene. It was discovered in 2020, and in 2021 it was open to the public. It means I think it's necessary to the public to have an access to the site and to the research. And I think what we are trying to do is not very easy because we have some conservation issues, of course. But I think the responsibility of the Côa Valley is to disseminate the rapid dissemination of the result to the society. And this is a challenge. It's a big challenge. But I think it has been done. Many information is missing. At this moment, missing is mostly the reconstruction of paleo environment. It means you have few data about vegetation, for example, because the soil and acid, it means we have a bad preservation of pollens, for example, of charcoal. This is a problem. We can reconstruct. We have many depictions of animals, but very few bone remains. It's a taphonomical problem. I think it's a question, and we have a good image of daily life of everything related to stones, rock art, also stone tools, some structure, fireplace. We know what people were doing with stones, but you have few information about research, biological researches they use, and why they choose this region. It means we know it was very important for us because we did many rock art. It means you have a density of occupation, but you have few archaeological information about the environment. And this is what is missing at this moment. And we have to do really some study about this. We have some result about Palaeology at this moment. We have some for 15,000 years ago. We will be able to see what was vegetation, which kind of plants was plants population in the Côa Valley. I think this part is missing. And what is missing at this moment, it's the question of direct context of a rock art.
That's
For example, we know that the rock art of Fariseo is older than 20,000, but we need exactly to know what is the relationship with the context and the rock art. And
has anyone attempted to publish or write articles or books about what this rock art meant to the people who crafted it? It's called theology, religion, cosmology.
At this moment, we are thinking about a project about neuroscience. It means to understand not what is the meaning of rock art. I think it's not this, but for example, for the superimposition of animation. To know what's happening in the brain when you are looking at a big superimposition, for example. Because for many people, it's very difficult to understand when you have animals superimposed, and to understand how the brain is working for an animation also, because we have to think that animation of a Palaeolithic animation is something they discovered 30,000 years ago, and it was only rediscovered in the 20th century. It means it's something fabulous, I think, to think.
No, that's absolutely remarkable.
Animation, I think, something fabulous. And superimposition, I think, we are looking at as a difficulty to legibility of a depiction, but I think there's really very important meaning of this superimposition. And I think you have to understand how brain is working. To see, I think we have a project about this. But I think for me, the question of the direct context of the rock art, I think, and portable art is fabulous for this, because when you find portable art, you can say, for example, the portable art we find from 12,000 years ago, we know what we were really depicting, stylistically what we were doing 12,000 years ago. And we need some portable art from the early Upper Palaeolithic, and this is what is really missing. And I think what for me is missing, I was thinking 20 years ago, I was thinking that rock art they did some rock art in some living places. And at this moment, I think rock art is not really in some living places. It means we find the context for the position after realization of the depiction. It means, but I think the rock art, the most important site of rock art, probably we're not the site where we have the most concentration of settlement of people who are living. And I think this separation of rock art with living place, I think it's something we have to develop with some dating, direct dating of layer directly associated with rock art. And it's what's really missing at this moment. It means we find one more time, we have to find the specific geological condition to preserve the context of rock art realization.
What would you like to leave with our listeners they should take away from our discussion today about the Côa Valley and the Côa rock art? What is the takeaway here, the theme, the value, the particular impact that your discoveries have had on our understanding of the past?
Two aspects. I think the first one, it was at the beginning, it changed completely the vision of the rock art. It means we cannot think now that it was only that Paleolithic rock art is only cave art. I think it changed completely. Valley is an example of, we can find more depiction of early Paleolithic than all the other side of Iberia. It means really rock opener was part of the rock art. It means we cannot forget it. The Côa Valley is most important to show that Paleolithic art is not only cave art. And the second one, I think, is that if you imagine that the Côa Valley was unknown 30 years ago, and now is one of the most important places to study Upper Paleolithic and the question of context of rock art, it means that I think there's many things to do to find in archaeology, because we were in central Iberia, and 30 years ago everybody was saying nobody was living in central Iberia because it was a plateau with high elevation, it was very cold, nobody was living, and I think it changed completely because probably I think during the next century I think it will be the highest concentration of density of occupation of Upper Paleolithic. It means something completely unknown because nobody was looking for Upper Palaeolithic. It is one more time, if you're not looking for something, you don't find it.
Yeah,
I think it's really the best example of this. And but the map can change completely in 30 years. And I think it's positive for us, for archaeology, that it's happened in some continents, but I think everybody was thinking it could be possible in South America and in Africa and some Asia. But it's possible also, I think, in Europe. And I think it's something very positive, that there is many things to find in some region where you are not expecting to find some phase. It will be possible to find. For example, occupation of Southern America. Nobody was thinking. I did some excavation in the 90s also, and when we have some datation of 25,000 years ago, everybody was thinking it's impossible. And now it's possible. I think archaeology is something can change very rapidly.
Absolutely. And it's very exciting to be involved in this profession, because just when you think it was safe to go back in the water, you find that the whole picture has changed in a heartbeat.
For example, Fariso site with the construction of a dam was not discovered because nobody were looking in this kind of situation. It means archaeology needs some time to create some models. And only solution is to find the first site, to understand what are conditions, and to create the model and to find the other one, I think. But you have to find the first one.
Well, Dr. Aubry, I'm just honored and blessed to have you on our podcast, and I'm really enthused and happy that you had a chance to share your discovery and your joy and your profession, your lifetime, your goals.
Yes.
It's been a blessing.
You are very lucky, I think. It's a nice profession.
And I call it endlessly engaging.
Yes.
Thank you all for listening, and God bless. See you in the flip-flop, gang.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Find show notes and contact information at www.arcpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.